This presentation is designed to cover some of the major concepts behind whole language teaching. There may be other concepts, but these are 5 of the major concepts that you want to keep in mind as you think about whole language teaching. Before we cover any details, it's important to indicate that this particular PowerPoint should be reinforced by the article that you've read, A Whole Language Program for Refugee Children. And you'll see there are number references to some of the numbers found within this article as we go along, and I'll point those out. Some background, first of all, whole language is not a method or a curriculum. It's a general philosophy or approach to teaching that's supposed to guide your instruction. Okay. And whole language, because it relies so heavily on teacher creativity and your judgments and your experience, so it can't be packaged or set in a pre-established curriculum that you can buy off the shelf. The reason is obvious, because it depends on the way that you approach teaching of a particular topic. So now we'll cover the 5 major concepts behind whole language. And the first is that literacy is best accomplished under the same conditions in which the first language is learned. And notice the number 1 in parentheses at the end of the line. This is meant to back up the idea that's found on number 1 in the article that you read. And number 1 states, children learn a second language in much the same way as they learn their first language. So why do researchers look at the features of L1 acquisition? And also, second language literacy should parallel first language home literacy. That's the reason, which is number 8, item 8 in your reading. Here are some of the reasons that the whole language instruction and manners in which it's supposed to parallel first language acquisition. Okay. So first of all, parents make extra efforts so that their language is comprehensible to the child. That is, it's understood. It's understandable, which relates to number 2 in your handout. You know that in first language acquisition, the learning environment is relaxed. Okay. The focus of speech is on the function, not the form. Getting things done with language. Topics that parents use with their kids are here and now topics. Okay? They're not abstract. They're not related to things that happened 3 or 4 weeks ago. And also, language rules are learned subconsciously. So some learning should be done that is subconscious. Not everything has to be direct or conscious learning. And as we know, first language acquisition allows for a silent period, a period in which the child doesn't have to say anything. And therefore, so should second language acquisition. Other whole language characteristics. Okay. Language should be kept whole. And what we mean by that is it's not divided into subparts or studied in pieces. Okay. And you have the visual down below. On the right-hand side, you have pieces of a puzzle. That's not the way we want to divide up language. On the left-hand side, we've got this nice circular whole. Also, related to this idea, language is learned best when it's first presented as meaningful wholes. Then smaller parts can be studied. Also, concepts are learned best when they're first presented as meaningful wholes, and then they can be divided into smaller parts. Okay. So let's talk about a couple of examples that follow this idea when we're talking about content and language. So for example, before we talk about details of what happens in an experiment or exactly what the parts are, we're going to do the experiment first. Before we talk about phonics instruction, we're going to read a whole book first. Then we can go back and do the phonics instruction. Before we talk about chemical equations and little parts, we're going to actually do a chemistry experiment. So the idea is to do the whole experience first, then we can break it into subparts. Then we've got this poor guy who looks like he's having a bad time, and so here are some examples which would violate that idea. One would be if we, for example, talk about initial B, phonics, before we read brown bear, brown bear. Another example would be going over long vocabulary lists before we read a book. Or looking at parts before we look at the whole. Another example would be to talk about rules for writing before we actually write. It's better to write something than look at the problems, and then we can talk about some writing rules rather than to do the rules first. Okay. Or we might do a particular math problem before we talk about why we're doing the problems and how they can be used. Those are all examples of doing the parts before the whole. Let's look at some other whole language characteristics. Make teaching activities meaningful and authentic. Okay. So authentic means it's functional, it's what happens in real life, it's what real people do. So you can ask yourself those questions, do real people make notes? Yes, they do. Do real people write in journals? Yes, they do. Do real people do exercises in the back of chapter 5? No. Do real people memorize long vocabulary lists? No. So those are not meaningful and authentic activities. If the activity is meaningful, it tends to be remembered better. Students take that activity and go at it more earnestly, put more effort into it. So we're always looking for meaningful and authentic activities. Another characteristic of whole language is that knowledge and related tasks should be integrated, not compartmentalized. Okay? Now, integrated means that we connect the content areas, just like the woman who's connecting the cord down there. If the right-hand side would be science and the left-hand side would be reading, we're going to connect reading and writing. If the right-hand side might be math and the left-hand side might be writing, then we're connecting writing and math. So integrating means connecting content areas, and that's exactly what you're doing in your thematic unit, trying to show how you're connecting different areas of content. Notice on the right-hand side you have these shelves that have dividers. Those are compartments. And so you could kind of look at each compartment as a subject area, and you notice there are dividers between those compartments. So what happens in reading class couldn't get over and mix with what happens in science class. That's not the way we want to teach. Compartmentalized teaching is kind of an old style of teaching. Okay, so notice we've got a nice vehicle down at the bottom to reinforce our idea. So language is the vehicle, or what we say the means, for better cognition and better thinking. It's the way that humans use to think better. And so lots of focus is put on the quality of the language, not the quantity. When developed and used effectively, language helps us do things. It helps us categorize. It helps us analyze. It helps us solve problems. It helps us to clarify and evaluate or negotiate ideas. All these things are almost impossible without language. So no wonder that people who espouse the whole language philosophy take great care to make sure that the kind of language that we're using is of high quality and it's not just repetition or kind of a mindless use of language. You can think about good activities like language experience approach and how we use that language to kind of to repeat in a way what happened, but to think about what happened, to analyze it, then to kind of solve our writing problems, to negotiate how we're going to put the book together, etc. So this is simply kind of a flow chart for how whole language advocates see language as improving thinking. So first, we start with a good activity. That's key. It's stimulating, it's authentic. It requires good oral language, such as reader's theater, creating a story map, doing your own logo, science experiments. All those require good language. Now, because we're using language well, this creates better thinking, better cognition. You're using your brain more effectively. And that leads to better language use in the next activity, which leads to better thinking, which leads to better language. So it's circular. And when we use language effectively, this is the idea of what happens in the whole language program.